Welcome to the de Havilland Aircraft Museum. A lot of people who come to the museum are quite struck by this exhibit that's behind me, because it isn't a de Havilland aircraft. It's not even a powered aircraft. It's an unpowered HORSA Glider made by a company called Airspeed. So what's it doing at this museum, the de Havilland Aircraft Museum? So to answer that intriguing question, I'm joined by Martin, who's part of the team that are actually restoring this incredible aircraft. Martin, welcome to the channel.
Thanks, Dennis, and welcome to our Airspeed HORSA Assault Glider exhibit.
Right, so tell me, why is the HORSA here in this particular museum? What's the link between the HORSA and de Havilland?
Airspeed were a small but highly regarded aircraft manufacturer of the 1930s. Mm-hmm. Ironically, they were formed by two former de Havilland employees, right. A chap called Hessel Tiltman and Neville Shute Norway.
So that's a name that I've heard before. So where have I heard that name?
A lot of people say that as well. He later became Neville Shute, the famous novelist.
Right.
And I should point out that he had left by the time the HORSA came on the scene, so he had nothing to do with the HORSA. Airspeed operated throughout the 1930s, making sort of medium-sized aircraft. They had no experience of building gliders. June 1940, Airspeed were bought out by de Havilland. De Havilland very quickly moved the Airspeed design team into the apprentices school over the road there at Hatfield. While this was going on, the Air Ministry awarded Airspeed the contract to build a 25-seat assault glider with the personal backing of Winston Churchill.
So where was the idea of gliders, of all things? Where did that come from?
As with so many ideas, it came from Germany. Gliding was very popular in Germany between the wars, and they designed a glider called the DFS 230. It was a 10-man glider, not huge, but much bigger than your normal soaring glider.
Right. Because they weren't allowed to use engines, were they?
That's why they were so keen on gliding. It got around the Treaty of Versailles, but never mind. But yes, and they scored a wonderful coup with this type of glider. On the 10th of May 1940, they attacked and subdued a massive fortress in Belgium called Fort Eben Emael. Mm-hmm. A small group of gliders landed right on the roof of it and surrendered within 12 hours.
So this was a new type of warfare, this was a new aspect of the Blitzkrieg that hadn't been done before.
Never been done before. At the time it was almost like science fiction, and the Germans made fantastic propaganda use of this. You know, it was this thing descending silently from the sky, an unstoppable force, and actually caused quite a panic in this country. The idea behind us having assault gliders came personally from Winston Churchill. He was aware that we needed allies, mainly the USA, who, don't forget, weren't in the war at that time. Right. So he needed to be proving to people that we weren't finished, that we were thinking aggressively for attacking the continent. Okay. It was one of a number of things like SOE and the bombing campaign against Germany that Churchill personally promoted. The first offensive operation by a HORSA glider was in November 1942, when two of them were towed across the North Sea to attack the heavy water plant at Vermork, of Heroes of Telemark fame.
So this was the attack attempting to stop the Germans developing nuclear weapons by getting to this heavy water plant.
That's absolutely right. It was a disaster. That was using. They couldn't wait to start using it, and a lot of brave men were terribly tragically killed. And then in 1943, of course, you had the invasion of Sicily. These were heavily used in that.
Okay.
And another interesting thing about the invasion of Sicily, people say, how far could you fly in a HORSA glider? A small force of HORSAs was towed from Cornwall to North Africa, a 10-hour flight, to ferry them out there for the invasion of Sicily.
I mean, I've always thought of gliders as being, you know, an hour or so at flight and then they get released.
No, the range of the bomber was the limit on these, where they could fly to.
And then later on, many of us have seen A Bridge Too Far. Yes. Many of us have seen also that the gliders were used at Pegasus Bridge and so on and so forth. Correct. I guess those were the main events where the HORSA was used?
Yeah. There were three main operations for the HORSA. D-Day was the first, and indeed the most successful. And we have to make the point that the first British troops to set foot on Norman soil that night of D-Day step from a HORSA glider. There were a
Right.
number of HORSA gliders which landed right next to Pegasus Bridge. Remarkable feat of arms that was.
Yeah.
And then of course there was the bridge too far at Arnhem. 500 HORSA gliders went into Arnhem in 2 days there. So really Arnhem wouldn't have happened without the HORSA, because this could carry anti-tank guns, jeeps, ammunition, all the support that the paratroopers needed. So without this they wouldn't have been able to get 60 miles behind enemy lines. In retrospect, bit off more than they could chew, but that's the
another
joy of
story.
hindsight.
Yeah.
And then of course most successfully of all was the crossing of the Rhine in March 1945,
Right.
Operation Varsity. Great success, and that was in fact the largest ever use of airborne forces. So yeah, that takes us through to the end of the war.
Fantastic.
So they saw a lot of action.
Okay. I mean, looking at this exhibit here, I'm struck by the fact that it was a monstrous aircraft.
The HORSA Glider, when it was designed, it was the largest glider at that time ever built. Pretty much as big as a Sterling bomber, which was the largest 4-engine bomber in British service. So it weighed 3.5 tons, it's unloaded. Fully loaded, it was exactly double, it was 7 tons.
Wow. Okay. And how many of them did they make in the end?
This is another thing. The exact figure isn't known because records were not kept, but
Okay.
the Ministry of Aircraft Production and most researchers put it at around about 3,600, 3,800, give or take a few.
That's a substantial production line.
It was designed right from the start for mass production because, of course, this was a one-way trip for a glider. They didn't come back, and you needed a lot of them for every attack. It wasn't known how many attacks there would be on Europe and how quickly. So yes, you had to keep a strategic reserve of these things, big enough to go into action at very short notice. So yeah, there were a lot of them lying around the countryside at one stage.
So we're really quite privileged that we've got this exhibit here, this tribute to the effect that the glider had on warfare. We're really glad we've got that. What can you tell me about this particular exhibit?
This particular exhibit, yes, it's actually been here for a long time. It arrived here in 1975. It was donated from a farm in Oxfordshire. Obviously after the war, lots of these were sold off for use as temporary accommodation, caravans, you know. And this one was bought by a chap who just bought himself an MG sports car, which fitted very neatly in the back. As a little garage.
So it's used as a
outside.
garage?
Used as a garage. There isn't a single original HORSA left.
Not a single one in the world?
Not in the world.
So we have got some pretty remarkable exhibits here.
Yeah, this is. It is original. It's 75% original. Some of the woodwork had rotted away over the years and we've had to replace it.
Right.
But 75% of it is as it came out of the factory in World War II. So yeah, it's a rare sight. In this country, there's only about 3-4 places where you can see original fuselages and original cockpits. There are now some replicas around. There's a full-size replica in Holland and there's another one in France. They're very impressive, but they're not the real thing.
They're not the real thing.
Ours is the real thing.
So we've got we've got what remains of a real HORSA.
Yes.
And so this fuselage and a nose, they would fit together?
Not quite, as many of the experts point out to us. What we do have is a Mark I fuselage and a Mark II cockpit. The difference between the two marks was that towards the end of the war, the main problem was you were trying to load vehicles through this ramp here and then try to get it out by taking the tail off when you arrived at your destination. This was rather clumsy. The reason being, it was originally designed as a 25-man glider.
Right.
Vehicles and artillery pieces weren't even considered then.
So the picture
These came
we've got,
later.
So the picture we've got of a Jeep being loaded into the side, that was a later innovation then?
Yes, indeed. The difference between the Mark I and the Mark II is the Mark II had a swivelling, hinging cockpit. So it would, when they landed, it would swing to one side and they could drive straight out of the front. Much safer, much quicker.
So this is, I guess this is where the Jeep would come in?
Yeah, this is an original loading door, which, as you can see, folds up into that aperture there.
Right.
Which, in wartime, there'd have been an extra piece here to act as a loading ramp. And yes, so the idea was to drive a 1/4 ton Jeep up here, and then a very sharp turn right into the fuselage.
So we haven't
Not an easy manoeuvre.
So we haven't got a Jeep, but it looks like we've got a bicycle.
We have indeed got a bicycle, and it's quite a rare bicycle. It's an original BSA folding paratroopers bicycle, and each HORSA Glider would have carried at least one of these. I mean, people look at it as if it's something amusing, and you say, no, I mean, you've just landed in your HORSA Glider. Your HQ troops might have landed a mile and a half away.
Right.
So instead of some poor devil having to walk with his kit and his rifle all the way, he'd hop on the bike and go over to get his orders.
So this is a messenger.
Very much a messenger.
Okay, well, talk me through what else we've got here very briefly. There's a destructor box. What is that for then, Martin?
Destructor box, well, the idea was that you've just landed your glider and you don't really want to leave it there for the Germans might eventually use it. Basically, it was going to have an incendiary device placed in there, and you'd pull the blue touch paper when you finish with the glider.
Blow up your glider?
And up it would go in smoke, yes. Actually, it wasn't used that much, which is probably why we've got the destructor box. Most of them, by the time they'd landed and the tail had been pulled off or the undercarriage had collapsed, they were pretty badly damaged anyway.
And these pressure bottles, now, clearly we're not going to go to high altitude. We're not going to need this for oxygen or anything.
No.
So what's this about?
HORSA gliders had massive flaps so that they could land very steeply and then level out to stalling speed very quickly. The idea was to get down as fast as possible. The air bottles here, they were pressurised to about 200 pounds a square inch of compressed air. These would drive the flaps.
Okay.
So there'd be enough air in there for basically 1 or 2 applications of flap coming down. It also provided the air for the air brakes on the wheels, and later models in fact had differential braking, so that gave the pilot quite a bit of control over exactly where he was landing. So yes, you had these things were under the cockpit floor, and all the air would go along those pipes. We're quite proud of this. We've got the original pipes running along the top there, and they would go into the wing centre section, and then they would drive the flaps and the brakes. Right, there's some interesting stuff here, and quite a lot of it is inside the fuselage, so should we go and take a look?
Yeah, great. Well, there's not much space here, and I'm imagining myself fully equipped with my backpack and my rifle and everything. It's going to be a bit cramped, isn't it?
Yep, it was a cramped journey, not very comfortable at all.
Right.
A lot of people got airsick in these because
I can believe
apparently the movement when they were on tow, because of the prop wash and everything else, tended to be sort of a rather porpoising movement. So I think, yeah, you were quite glad to get there, really.
So inside here, you begin to appreciate the amount of design work, the amount of manufacturing work that went into building these one-off gliders.
Yes.
I mean, the work that's been put in here is incredible.
The story of the design is interesting. It was designed jointly by Airspeed, who of course knew about aircraft, but they worked hand in glove with a furniture manufacturer called Harris Liebes in Tottenham, who were brought in by the Air Ministry very, very early in the process.
A furniture manufacturing company.
Because they had great experience of mass production of plywood furniture.
Okay.
So they knew all about the glues and the presses and the stresses and so on and so forth. Originally, the Air Ministry wanted these built as cheaply as possible. The boss of the company, Herman Liebes, put them right on this, but he was able to use fairly cheap plywood on the roof because it's not stressed. But on the fuselage sides, like here, all the way along, he said the torque stresses are actually quite enormous, especially when it's fully loaded. It's being towed at 150 miles an hour. You've got 7 tons on tow.
This is a fully fledged aeroplane. This isn't just a toy.
It's an unpowered transport aircraft. And he said, so what you need here, it's all got to be laid at a very careful 45-degree angle to offset the torque. And also it's got to be the very best quality plywood, so that means no knot holes, no cracks, as you can see here, no knot holes at all. It's absolutely perfectly smooth, and the only place that came from in World War II, it all had to come from Canada. So the idea of cheap plywood went completely out of the window. These were built of the very best you could get.
So this is the similar plywood to what they would have been using on the Mosquito.
Very, very similar. It's birch plywood with spruce hardwoods as well, exactly the same as being used mostly on the Mosquito, you're quite right. And in fact, Harris Liebus built a very large number of, down at their factory in Tottenham, they built a lot of Mosquito fuselages.
So they were familiar with those as
very
well.
much, yeah.
So this was not a cheap thing to manufacture. No. This was a lot of hard work went into what was a plane that effectively was going to be thrown away.
Yeah, they were designed with an idea of 10 hours flight time and 100% wastage. In other words, one operation wouldn't come back. However, having said that, because people again say, oh, so the thing could fall apart at the drop of a hat, the prototype, the very first prototype that was built here, we know from our documentation it did a minimum of 87 test flights. So that's 87.
One glider, 87 flights.
One Horsa.
Not exactly used once, throw away.
No, and that was full flights, that is being released and landing and then going on. So that airframe took an awful lot of stress. But the idea was you'd only get one flight out of it. But none of them went back.
They were pretty robust aircraft, though.
Yeah, they were designed to be very strong indeed.
As a squaddy, I presumably would have a seat along here?
You would have one of these seats. We've still got the originals. These aren't yet fully restored, as you can see. This one is an original, sit down there. You'd have a seat and you'd have a full Sutton harness, like a pilot would, which clipped in behind and down to the fittings there. You can see another one. All these fittings were designed to hold you in, but also if you had guns and trailers and jeeps here, those would be used to lash down the cargo as well.
So at least you're strapped in.
You're strapped in. Yeah, everything is strapped in, and of course there's tremendous strength here. It's absolutely circular. This continues the circle and goes up the other side, so that all the stress of everything on the move, and so you're talking 1/4 of a ton of jeep or a ton of 6-pounder anti-tank gun being lashed in securely there. And it was secure. There were very few accidents of anything coming loose in a HORSA glider. So yeah, once again, they knew what they were doing. So
I hesitate to say that this was a safe aircraft.
As much as any, but it's quite interesting. It's a myth. Oh, they used to fall apart in mid-air. We've now done a lot of research work, and I can't find, unless something exploded on board, I can't find any reference to any of these falling apart in mid-air.
Okay.
It just didn't happen. They were strong and safe, and they were also very pleasant to fly. We've got a lot of first-hand accounts from glider pilots and such like, and no one criticised it. They say actually it was quite a pleasant plane to fly.
So they had RAF pilots flying it?
No, they were flown by the Army. They were flown by Army pilots, which is a strange contradiction. There weren't enough RAF pilots at the beginning of the war. They were needed to fly bombers and other aircraft. So the idea was put forward that yes, there were frustrated pilots, would-be pilots in the Army who just didn't want to be square bashing for years on end. They wanted to have a go.
Right.
So that the glider pilots were all volunteers. And we've heard the theory put forward, well, all they had to do was sit there and, sit on the end of a tow rope. Every glider pilot had to qualify as a pilot on a de Havilland Tiger Moth.
So, having flown this glider in, you've landed, let's say, at Pegasus Bridge or wherever. What do you do then? Are you just an ordinary squaddy?
No, you went and fought the Germans. The glider pilot regiment are very proud of the fact that Brigadier Chatterton, their boss, described them as total soldiers. In other words, when they landed, their actual job was to make sure, obviously, the glider was landed, that everything was safely unloaded. They would then remain with the men that they'd flown in. So if it was an infantry unit, they'd join them. If it was a gunner unit, they would join them to help protect them from enemy attack. And then ultimately they were supposed to join up with their own people when they got to like divisional HQ or whatever. What effectively happened, for instance, as at Arnhem and indeed in Normandy, they filled in they were so highly trained, they would fill in anywhere where there was a particular problem. They were very effective. In fact, in the Battle of Arnhem, they suffered the highest losses of any regiment, percentage-wise.
I must admit, I've got a lot of admiration for the pilots who were also soldiers.
Yeah.
Can we go and have a look outside at the cockpit that they would have used?
Absolutely. Yep, no problem at all. Shall we walk around the front and have a look?
Sure.
Oh, so here we have the Mark II Horsa cockpit.
That looks fairly well equipped, actually.
Yes, it's a very good restoration. As you can see, you've got the original harnesses in there for the pilots. We've managed to sort of put some of the fixtures and fittings that were missing in. So for instance, up at the top there, we've got the first aid kit over there, and we've got the thermos flask, the large size.
Oh, you must
there.
have your thermos flask, must have your tea.
And the last thing we managed to get hold of is, at the moment sitting on the co-pilot's seat, we've got a very large Bergen rucksack. These were only issued to special forces in World War II. The commandos had them, the SAS had them, and indeed the glider pilots had them. It's a very large, very heavy pack. We're glad to have that because it's very typical for the aircraft.
Right. And then down here at the nose, is this where the tow rope would be?
No, that was the intercom. Went in there for the pilot to speak to the pilot of the tug aircraft in front. We've actually got the cable and the rope over here. This is what did all the work. Here's the tow rope, and indeed there's the cable which would have come out of here and gone through to the radio in the tug aircraft. These were quite extraordinary, these ropes, when you think they're pulling 7 tons along. That's, you know, just amazing to think of it. So the tow rope would have gone, as we saw before on the nose wheel section on the Mark II, would have gone into the Horsa and pulled it along.
Martin, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for showing us this incredible exhibit. And I hope you've enjoyed watching this video. If so, please like and subscribe. Please keep in touch with us. Check out our website for the opening hours, and do come and visit us at the museum at London Colney, where you can see this Horsa Glider, probably the largest remnants of a Horsa Glider anywhere in the country. See you at the museum.